You have spent years accumulating knowledge, trying to decipher the mechanics of spirituality and the mind, yet the feeling of exhaustion and anxiety still knocks on your door, doesn't it? What if I told you that your relentless search for an absolute truth is actually the hidden gear keeping you trapped inside a vast simulation? At some point, the search stopped feeling alive and started feeling heavy. Every new answer gave you a moment of relief, but it never lasted. Soon after, another question appeared, another doubt, another need to understand more. And without noticing, you became dependent on answers just to feel stable. This is the prison. Not the lack of truth, but the constant need to define it. Because every answer you hold too tightly becomes another layer between you and what is real. The illusion doesn't confuse you by hiding reality. It overwhelms you with explanations. And the more you try to solve everything, the further you move from the quiet clarity that was never lost. Do you know that horrible feeling of laying your head on the pillow, wanting nothing more than to rest? But your brain enters an uncontrollable spiral of thoughts, trying to predict and organize tomorrow? This is not a factory defect in your body, but the symptom that your vital energy is being drained in an attempt to give solidity to problems that are not even real. At first it feels responsible, even intelligent. Your mind tells you that this constant movement is necessary, that if you just think a little more, plan a little better, anticipate one more scenario, you will finally gain control. But look closely at what is actually happening. The more you think, the less settled you feel. The more you try to organize life internally, the more chaotic it becomes. This is the hidden paradox of the accelerated mind. It promises stability, but produces instability. Your thoughts begin to stack on top of each other without space to breathe. One unfinished idea pulls another and another until your inner world feels crowded, loud, almost suffocating. And in this state, even small things start to feel heavy. A simple conversation, a minor decision, a task for tomorrow, everything gains a weight it didn't originally have. It's as if your mind is trying to turn possibilities into solid objects, trying to make the future feel predictable, fixed, safe. But the future is not solid. It never was. So this effort creates friction because you are trying to force something fluid into a rigid form. And that friction is what you feel as anxiety. Notice how your body reacts in those moments. The tightness in your chest, the subtle tension in your jaw, the restless energy in your legs. These are not random sensations. They are signals. Your system is telling you that something unnatural is happening, that too much energy is being invested in maintaining an internal construction that has no real foundation. Because most of what your mind is working on in those late-night spirals is not happening now. It exists only as mental projection, a simulation, an illusion that feels urgent simply because your attention is locked into it. And attention, when sustained, gives the impression of reality. This is why the thoughts feel so convincing, not because they are true, but because you are feeding them with uninterrupted focus. The mind, when accelerated, doesn't question itself. It builds momentum. It keeps generating content in an attempt to resolve a tension that it is actually creating. You might even notice a strange detail. The problems rarely get solved in this state. They just evolve. One concern turns into another version of the same concern. One plan leads to 10 more plans. It's not resolution, it's expansion. Like a wheel spinning faster and faster without ever moving forward. And somewhere inside this movement, there is a quiet assumption that goes unnoticed. If I stop thinking, something will go wrong. That belief keeps the engine running. It convinces you that rest is dangerous, that silence is neglect, that slowing down means losing control. But what if the opposite is closer to the truth? What if this constant acceleration is not protecting you, but exhausting you? What if the clarity you are looking for cannot exist in a mind that never pauses long enough to see clearly? Because clarity doesn't come from more noise, it comes from space. Right now, your mind is trying to solve life the way a machine solves equations, by processing more data, faster and faster. But life is not an equation to be solved like that. And the more you treat it this way, the more disconnected you become from something much more precise inside you. There is an intelligence in you that does not operate through overthinking. It does not rush, it does not panic, and it does not need to simulate every possible future. But as long as the accelerated mind dominates your attention, this quieter intelligence remains buried, not gone, just unheard. And this is where most people make a crucial mistake. They assume the solution is to improve their thinking, to become better at analyzing, better at predicting, better at controlling. They try to refine the very mechanism that is creating the exhaustion. They consume more information, more strategies, more answers, believing that somewhere in that accumulation lies relief. But what if that accumulation is exactly what is feeding the cycle? What if the weight you feel is not coming from life itself, but from the constant attempt to mentally dominate it? This is where the illusion deepens, because the mind doesn't just move fast. It convinces you that its speed is necessary, that without it, everything would collapse, and so without realizing it, you keep reinforcing the very pattern that drains you. Understanding this is not yet the end of the cycle, but it begins to expose something important. The problem is not your life, and it is not even your thoughts individually. It is the relationship you have with this constant mental acceleration, and the belief that more thinking will eventually set you free. But that belief carries a hidden cost, one that most people only notice when the exhaustion becomes impossible to ignore. And that cost is directly tied to a habit that seems harmless on the surface, but quietly shapes the entire way you interact with reality. There is an extremely dangerous mistake that almost every seeker makes daily, believing that control over life will come through the accumulation of more and more concepts and external answers. This belief acts like a parasite in your electromagnetic field. I will show you the counterintuitive attitude that deactivates this drain later on, but first, you need to understand what science has already revealed about the world you are trying to force into your favor. At some point, the search stops being about understanding and quietly becomes about protection. You collect ideas the way someone builds walls, hoping that if the structure is strong enough, nothing unpredictable will get in. Books, videos, philosophies, techniques, each one promises a piece of certainty. And for a moment it feels comforting, like you finally have something solid to hold on to. But look at what happens over time. Instead of feeling lighter, you feel more burdened. Instead of clarity, there is confusion, because now it's not just life you're trying to manage, it's also all the conflicting explanations about life. One voice says surrender, another says take control. One says trust the process, another says design your reality. And in the middle of all that noise, you are left trying to decide which version of truth is the right one. This is where the trap tightens. The mind starts to treat truth as something that can be owned, stored, and defended, something you can finally get right if you gather enough information. But truth, when turned into a fixed concept, loses its living nature. It becomes rigid, and anything rigid cannot fully match a reality that is constantly changing. So without realizing it, you begin to rely on dead structures to navigate a living experience. That's why even the most sophisticated ideas can still leave you feeling lost, because the issue is not the quality of the concepts, it's the dependence on them. Every time you cling to an answer as final, you reduce your ability to actually observe what is happening in front of you. And observation is the only place where something real can be seen. Science, in its most honest form, does not deal in absolute certainties. It works through hypotheses, probabilities, constant revision. What is considered true today can be refined tomorrow, not because science is weak, but because reality is too complex to be captured in a single permanent conclusion. Yet the mind resists this openness. It wants closure. It wants something definitive to stand on. So it turns even flexible knowledge into fixed beliefs. And once that happens, perception narrows. You stop seeing what is and start seeing what confirms what you already believe. This is how the illusion sustains itself, not by hiding reality, but by filtering it, by giving you just enough coherence to feel certain while quietly removing everything that contradicts that certainty. And the more certain you become, the less you question. There is also a subtle emotional attachment involved. Certainty gives identity. It tells you who you are, what you believe, where you stand. Letting go of that can feel like losing ground, like stepping into something unstable. So even when a belief no longer serves you, part of you resists releasing it, not because it is true, but because it is familiar. This is why simply adding more knowledge doesn't solve the problem. It often deepens it, because now you have more material to defend, more positions to maintain, more mental effort invested in keeping everything consistent. And consistency, in this context, becomes another form of pressure. You start editing your own perception to avoid internal conflict, ignoring what doesn't fit, reinterpreting what challenges your view. Slowly, without noticing, you move further away from direct experience and deeper into interpretation. And interpretation, no matter how refined, is still a layer between you and reality. There is a moment, though, when this becomes too heavy to sustain, when the effort of maintaining all these certainties begins to crack. When you start to sense that no matter how much you learn, something essential is still missing. That moment is not failure, it's exposure. It reveals that the search itself may have been pointed in the wrong direction. That instead of collecting more answers, something else is being asked of you. Something far less comfortable for the mind, but far more aligned with what is real. Because if the structures you depend on are not as solid as they seem, then the world you are trying to control through them may not be as solid either. And this is where the ground begins to shift in a way the intellect cannot easily stabilize, opening space for a deeper question to emerge, not about which answer is correct, but about the very nature of what you have been calling reality all along. When you look at your own body or the walls around you, you see dense and unbreakable structures. However, quantum physics has already definitively proven that 99.99% of every atom is purely empty space. The material solidity that frightens you so deeply is merely a hologram of frequencies being translated and projected, second by second, by your own brain. Pause for a moment and really let that sink in. What feels solid, what feels fixed, what feels heavy and immovable is mostly space. Not metaphorically, but literally. The chair you're sitting on, the floor beneath your feet, even your own hands. All of it is made of particles so distant from each other that on a deeper level there is more nothing than something. And yet your experience tells a completely different story. Your senses report solidity. Your mind confirms it. Your body reacts to it as if everything around you is firm, stable, and defined. This gap between what is physically measured and what is psychologically perceived is where the illusion quietly takes form. Because your brain is not showing you reality as it is. It is showing you a translation, a useful one, a functional one, but still a translation. It converts frequencies, vibrations, and empty space into shapes, colors, textures, and boundaries so you can navigate the world. Without this process, you wouldn't be able to function, but the problem begins when you forget that this is a constructed experience. The moment you take this projection as absolute truth, everything becomes heavier than it actually is. Problems feel more rigid, situations feel more permanent. Fear gains strength because it appears to be anchored in something solid and unavoidable. If your reality is solid, then your problems must also be solid. And if they are solid, then they must be controlled, fixed, or eliminated with force. This is how the mind builds urgency. But if what you perceive is, at its core, fluid and dynamic, then the entire equation changes. What you call a problem is no longer a fixed object. It becomes a process, something in motion, something that can shift, dissolve, reorganize. And yet, the mind resists this perspective because it cannot easily control something that is not stable. So it keeps reinforcing the idea of solidity. It labels, defines, categorizes. It says this is the situation, as if it were final, as if it were locked in place. And every time you accept that label without question, you participate in making the illusion feel more real. This doesn't mean that the physical world doesn't exist in a practical sense. You still interact with it. You still respect its patterns. But there is a difference between interacting with reality and being psychologically imprisoned by the way it appears. And that prison is built through interpretation, not through matter itself. Think about how quickly your perception of something can change. A situation that felt threatening yesterday may feel irrelevant today. A conversation that seemed heavy can lose all its weight after a simple shift in understanding. What changed? Not the external structure, but the internal reading of it. That alone shows how unstable your experience of reality actually is. Now imagine what happens when this unstable perception is treated as something fixed and unquestionable. The mind starts reacting to its own projections as if they were absolute facts. It builds emotional responses on top of interpretations, and those responses reinforce the interpretations even further. A loop forms, and within that loop, the body begins to respond as if it were facing something concrete and immediate. Stress hormones rise, muscles tighten, breathing becomes shallow, all in response to something that, at its core, is not as solid as it seems. This is where the real impact begins to show, because even though the illusion exists at the level of perception, its consequences are experienced physically. The body does not distinguish between a solid external threat and a strongly believed internal projection. It reacts to both, so the more you believe in the rigidity of what you perceive, the more your system prepares to fight or resist it. And this is where a deeper imbalance starts to develop. Because maintaining this constant state of tension requires energy, a lot of it. The body cannot sustain it indefinitely without consequences. What begins as mental pressure slowly translates into biological strain. At first, it's subtle, a bit of restlessness, a slight tightness in the chest, a sense that you can't fully relax. But over time, as this pattern continues, the internal load increases. The mind keeps insisting that everything is solid, urgent, and needs to be controlled, and the body, listening to that signal, starts preparing for a battle that never truly arrives in the way it was imagined. And this is how a misunderstanding at the level of perception begins to cascade into something much deeper, something that no longer stays only in the mind, but starts shaping the entire internal chemistry of your system. As long as you fail to assimilate this fluid nature of matter, a destructive chain reaction gains strength. The need to control the illusory world begins as a slight pressure in your chest, but as you continue fighting to make your worldview prevail, the pressure rises to the limit of your nervous system. Your cells become flooded with cortisol, and you turn into a biological hostage of your own survival instinct. At first, it doesn't look serious. It feels like just stress, something normal, something everyone deals with. You might even wear it as a sign that you are engaged with life, that you care, that you're trying to do things right. But beneath that surface, something more silent is unfolding. Your body is listening to every thought you repeat. It does not evaluate whether a situation is truly dangerous or simply perceived as such. It responds to the signal. And when your mind constantly treats the illusion as something solid, urgent, and threatening, your body begins to organize itself around survival. Your breathing becomes shorter without you noticing. Your shoulders carry tension even when there is nothing to lift. Your sleep loses depth because the system never fully powers down. It remains alert, scanning, anticipating. This is not happening because your body is failing you. It is happening because it is trying to protect you based on the information it receives. And the information it receives is shaped by how you interpret reality. When every situation is filtered through control, prediction, and resistance, the message is clear. Something is wrong. Stay ready. So your system stays ready, not for minutes, but for hours. Not for hours, but for days. And slowly, this constant activation stops being an exception and becomes your baseline. That is where the real shift happens. You are no longer reacting to specific moments. You are living inside a continuous state of low-grade emergency. And from the inside, it starts to feel normal, familiar, almost invisible. But the cost is cumulative. Your energy begins to drain in ways that are hard to explain. You feel tired even after resting. Your patience shortens. Small things trigger disproportionate reactions. It becomes harder to focus, not because you lack discipline, but because your system is overloaded. And still, the mind keeps pushing the same strategy. Think more, control more, anticipate more. It doesn't realize that this very effort is what keeps the cycle alive. There is also something deeper happening at the cellular level. When stress hormones like cortisol remain elevated for long periods, the body starts prioritizing survival over balance. Functions that are not immediately necessary, like deep recovery, immune optimization, emotional regulation, begin to take a secondary role. It's not a dramatic collapse all at once. It's a gradual misalignment. And because it happens slowly, it's easy to miss. You adapt. You normalize the tension. You tell yourself that this is just how life is. that this constant pressure is part of being responsible, aware, prepared. But there is a difference between responding to life and being trapped in a permanent defensive posture. The illusion convinces you that everything depends on how tightly you hold things together, that if you relax, even slightly, something will fall apart. So you keep holding, you keep tightening, even when there is nothing in front of you that requires that level of force. And over time, that internal contraction becomes your default state. You might notice it in quiet moments, when there is finally nothing to do, nothing urgent, and yet your body cannot fully relax. There is a subtle agitation, a background noise that doesn't switch off, as if something is still unresolved, even when everything is objectively fine. That feeling is not coming from the present moment. It is the residue of accumulated tension that was never released, because the system never received a clear signal that it was safe to stop. And safety in this context does not come from solving every problem or controlling every variable. It comes from a shift in how reality itself is perceived. As long as the mind insists on treating its projections as solid threats, the body will continue responding accordingly. This is why trying to fix the body without addressing the perception behind it often leads to temporary relief at best. You can relax for a moment, distract yourself, even rest physically. But as soon as the same mental patterns return, the same biological responses follow. The loop reactivates. Breaking this cycle does not begin with forcing the body to calm down. It begins earlier, at the level where meaning is assigned, where thoughts are believed, where the illusion gains its authority. Because if that authority is not questioned, the body will keep obeying it. And this is where something unexpected starts to emerge, a point where everything you were taught about fighting for clarity, defending your perspective, and holding on to what feels true begins to show its limits. Because the very idea of truth that you have been trying to protect may be playing a much deeper role in sustaining this entire internal pressure. And it is exactly at this point that everything common sense has taught you completely collapses. You were always told that you needed to fight for the truth in order to destroy the lie. But the hidden mechanics of the universe work in the opposite way. Every concept carved in stone, every dogma or unquestionable truth that your intellect fiercely defends is, in its essence, the illusion itself. Trying to be right is imprisoning infinity inside a cage. This is not easy to accept, because the idea of truth feels sacred. It feels like the one thing you can rely on in a world that often seems unstable. So naturally, the mind clings to it. It builds identity around it. This is what I believe. This is what is real. And from that point on, everything is filtered through that position. But look closely at what that creates. The moment a truth becomes fixed, it stops being a tool and starts becoming a boundary. Instead of helping you see more, it begins to limit what you are willing to see. Anything that aligns with it is accepted. Anything that challenges it is resisted, ignored, or reshaped until it fits. This is how perception narrows without you noticing. And the more you invest in being right, the more energy is required to maintain that position. You have to defend it internally, constantly reaffirm it, protect it from doubt. Even subtle contradictions can create discomfort because they threaten the structure you've built. So tension returns, not because reality is attacking you, but because your mind is trying to hold something in place that was never meant to be fixed. There is also a deeper layer to this. When you identify with a belief, it becomes part of your sense of self. Letting go of it doesn't just feel like losing an idea, it feels like losing a piece of who you are. That's why people hold on to perspectives even when they no longer bring clarity or peace. It's not about truth anymore, it's about stability. But this stability is fragile, because it depends on conditions staying aligned with your expectations. The moment life presents something that doesn't match your internal model, friction appears again. And the mind reacts in the only way it knows, by trying to correct, control, or reject what doesn't fit. And just like before, the body follows. Tension builds, the nervous system tightens. The same biological patterns you've already felt begin to repeat themselves, now reinforced by something that feels even more justified, the need to be right. This is why the illusion becomes so convincing at this stage. It is no longer just about external situations or imagined futures. It is embedded in the very framework you use to interpret reality. It feels intelligent, structured, even necessary. But intelligence, when rigid, loses its ability to adapt. Real understanding is not something you hold. It is something that moves. It adjusts. It remains open enough to evolve as new observations arise. The moment it becomes fixed, it turns into a representation of the past, not a reflection of what is here now. And life does not operate in the past. So there is a quiet but powerful shift that begins to emerge here. Not through effort, not through replacing one belief with a better one, but through seeing the limitation of the entire approach. What if the goal is not to find the right truth, but to stop needing one? What if clarity is not something you achieve by defining reality, but something that appears when you stop trying to define it at all? At first, this can feel disorienting. The mind looks for something to grab onto and finds nothing solid. It interprets that as loss, as confusion. But beneath that initial reaction, there is also a subtle sense of space, a relief that is almost unfamiliar, because for the first time, you are not carrying the weight of maintaining a position. You are not forcing reality into a structure. You are simply allowing it to be as it is, without immediately labeling it, judging it, or trying to make it fit into a predefined idea. And in that space, something begins to change. The urgency softens. The need to react weakens. The constant pressure to resolve everything starts to lose its grip. Not because problems have disappeared, but because your relationship to them is no longer based on rigid interpretation. You are no longer fighting to prove something. And without that fight, a different kind of intelligence has room to emerge. One that does not depend on stored answers. One that does not rush to conclusions. One that can observe without immediately turning what it sees into another fixed truth. This is where the structure of the illusion begins to loosen in a way that cannot be forced, only noticed. Because once you see that every final truth is just another layer of interpretation, the need to defend it naturally starts to fade. And what remains is not emptiness in a negative sense, but an open field of perception that is no longer confined by rigid definitions. And it is from this open field that a completely different relationship with reality starts to become possible. One that does not rely on controlling what is seen, but on understanding the nature of what is seeing itself. If verbal answers are illusions, then what is real? In astrophysics, empty space is not a useless nothingness. It is the zero-point field, a matrix of incalculable energetic density from which all matter is born. In spirituality, this formidable space has a name your ego is terrified to face: silence. But how do you leap from the chaotic mind into this impenetrable space? Physics gives us the exact shortcut. It sounds abstract at first, almost distant from your daily life, but it is closer than anything you have ever experienced, because this empty space is not somewhere out there in the universe. It is present within every moment of your perception. It is the gap between thoughts, the pause before a reaction, the stillness that exists underneath all mental movement. The problem is not that silence is absent. The problem is that it is constantly being covered. Your mind has been trained to fill every open space with interpretation. The moment something happens, a thought appears, then another, then a chain of explanations, judgments, predictions. This continuous activity creates the impression that thinking is necessary for reality to function. But reality was never dependent on your commentary. In fact, the more the mind interferes, the more distorted your perception becomes. Not because thinking is wrong, but because it is being used compulsively. It doesn't know when to stop. And without stopping, it never allows you to notice what exists before thought shapes it. This is where the idea of the vacuum becomes deeply practical. In physics, the zero-point field is not empty in the sense of lacking. It is full of potential. It is the ground from which everything emerges. In the same way, silence in your direct experience is not a void to be feared. It is a space of pure possibility, where perception is not yet filtered, not yet reduced into categories. But to the ego, this feels threatening. Because the ego is built from definitions. It needs labels, conclusions, identities. Without them, it feels like it is dissolving. So it avoids silence, often without you realizing it. It keeps you occupied, thinking, analyzing, reacting. anything to prevent that open space from becoming noticeable. And this is how the illusion sustains itself at a deeper level, not only through what you think, but through your resistance to what exists before thinking begins. Now, the shortcut is not about forcing silence. That would only create more tension. It is about noticing what is already there, even in the middle of noise. Right now, as you read these words, there are small gaps between each sentence, tiny pauses where no thought is fully formed. They are subtle, almost invisible, but they are real. And in those gaps, there is no effort, no control, no need to define anything. There is just awareness. This awareness does not struggle. It does not rush. It does not try to fix or improve what it perceives. It simply allows things to appear and disappear. Thoughts come, stay for a moment, and leave. Sensations rise and fall. External events unfold. And through all of this, something remains unchanged. You might have overlooked it your entire life because it is so simple, so quiet. It does not announce itself, it does not demand attention, but it is always present, even when your mind is at its most chaotic. The shift begins when you stop chasing silence as a goal and start recognizing it as a background that never left. At first, this recognition is brief. A second, maybe less. A small moment where the mind pauses naturally without force. And in that moment, there is a different quality of experience. Lighter, less dense, as if the weight you were carrying suddenly disappears, even if nothing external has changed. That glimpse is enough to reveal something important. The constant effort you've been applying is not required for reality to continue. Life moves on its own. Breathing happens. The heart beats. Sounds appear and fade. Even thoughts themselves arise without you deliberately creating them. This alone begins to loosen the idea that you are responsible for controlling every aspect of your experience. And as that idea loosens, so does the tension attached to it. But the mind quickly tries to step back in. It wants to understand this silence, to define it, to turn it into another concept it can hold on to. It might say, "This is it," or "I need to stay here," or "How do I make this permanent?" And just like that, the movement returns. Not because silence disappeared, but because attention shifted back into grasping. This is a subtle but crucial point. The illusion does not only exist in obvious forms like stress or fear, it also appears in the attempt to capture what cannot be captured, to turn a living experience into a fixed state. And silence cannot be owned like that. It is not something you achieve and keep, it is something you stop overlooking. The more you notice this, the less you feel the need to interfere. And in that reduction of interference, something unexpected begins to happen. Your relationship with thoughts starts to change, not through force, but through distance. You begin to see them instead of being inside them. And that small shift, almost invisible at first, opens the door to a completely different way of moving through the same reality, one where the mind no longer dominates every moment, and where a quieter, more stable presence starts to take its place naturally. Immediate relief does not require you to fight fear through brute force. The very millisecond you stop judging the situation as good or bad and begin operating through the principle of the observer, simply witnessing thoughts as they happen, the friction ceases. Without the injection of your reactive emotion, the external wave of tension collapses and falls apart on its own. This sounds almost too simple, and that is exactly why it is often ignored. The mind is used to solving things through effort, through resistance, through doing something. So when it hears that relief can come from simply observing, it assumes that nothing is really happening. It underestimates the shift. But look closely at your own experience. The moment a thought appears, there is usually an immediate reaction. You agree with it, reject it, analyze it, or extend it. That reaction is so fast that it feels automatic, almost inseparable from the thought itself, and from that instant, a chain begins. One thought leads to another and then another, each one reinforced by your involvement. Now imagine a different response. A thought appears, maybe about tomorrow, maybe about something unresolved, and instead of following it, you notice it. You don't push it away and you don't engage with it. You let it be there, the same way you would notice a sound in the background. At first, it feels unusual. There is a slight gap, a sense of distance. The thought is still present, but it is no longer pulling you in the same way. And in that small gap, something important is missing: the emotional charge that normally fuels the process. Without that charge, the thought has no momentum. It lingers for a moment, and then it fades naturally. Not because you forced it to disappear, but because you stopped feeding it. This is the relief valve that most people overlook. Not control, not suppression, but non-participation. The illusion loses strength when it is not reinforced. This does not mean that thoughts will stop appearing. They will continue, just as sounds continue, just as sensations come and go. The difference is in your relationship to them. You are no longer inside the stream, being carried by it without awareness. You are standing at the edge, watching it move. And from that position, everything changes. The urgency decreases. What felt immediate and pressing starts to feel less solid. You begin to see that many of the thoughts that once triggered strong reactions are repetitive, predictable, almost mechanical. They are not fresh insights. They are patterns. Patterns that only persist because they are constantly engaged. There is also a subtle shift in the body. When you stop reacting to every mental movement, the nervous system receives a different signal. It is no longer being told that every thought represents a threat or a problem that needs to be solved, and slowly it begins to recalibrate. The tightness softens. The breath deepens without effort. The constant background tension starts to loosen. This is not something you achieve once and keep forever. It is something you return to again and again in small moments, while sitting, while walking, while listening to someone speak. Each time you notice instead of react, you reinforce a different way of being. And over time, this changes your baseline. But there is an important detail here that is easy to miss. Observing is not the same as pretending not to care. It is not indifference. You still perceive, you still understand, you still respond when necessary. The difference is that your response is no longer driven by automatic emotional reactions. It comes from clarity, not from pressure. And clarity has a different quality. It is quieter but more precise. It does not rush. It does not need to prove anything. It simply sees what is there and allows the appropriate action to emerge when needed. At first, the mind may try to interfere with this process. It might say, "Am I doing this right, or is this working, or I need to stay in this state?" And in that moment, it is already trying to turn observation into another task, another goal to achieve. But the observer does not operate like that. It does not need validation. It does not measure success. It simply notices. Even the thought, "I am not doing this correctly," can be observed in the same way. And when it is, it loses its authority just like any other thought. This is where a deeper stability begins to form. Not because you eliminated the illusion completely, but because you are no longer fully identified with it. You can see it arise, play out, and dissolve without being consumed by it. And as this becomes more natural, something else starts to emerge almost on its own. A sense of space that is not fragile. A quiet presence that remains even when the external world becomes chaotic. Situations still happen, people still react, life continues to move with all its unpredictability. But internally, there is less to hold on to, less to defend, less to control. And from this space, a different kind of strength begins to take shape, one that does not come from resisting the world, but from no longer being pulled by every movement within it. By letting go of the obsession to decipher the universe, a magnetic barrier naturally rises around you. Society will continue drowning in despair, fighting over politics and illusory narratives of control. But now, the monumental difference is that you move through this theater without taking the play seriously. The gravitational weight of human drama no longer finds a place to attach itself to your energy. This does not mean you become distant or disconnected from life. In fact, the opposite begins to happen. You are more present, more aware, but less entangled. You see what is happening without immediately being pulled into it. Conversations, al-akhbar, opinions, emotional reactions from others. They still reach you, but they don't stick the way they used to. Before, everything felt personal. Every disagreement, every unexpected situation, every piece of information seemed to demand a reaction. It was as if the world was constantly knocking on your door, asking for your attention, your judgment, your position. Now, Something subtle has changed. You still hear the knocking, but you don't feel obligated to open the door every time. This is where a kind of immunity begins to form. Not as a defense built through resistance, but as a natural consequence of not feeding what drains you. The illusion loses its grip because it no longer finds the same level of engagement inside you. And without engagement, it cannot sustain itself in the same way. You may notice this most clearly in situations that used to trigger you. A comment that once stayed in your mind for hours now passes more quickly. A problem that would have created tension now feels lighter, more manageable. Not because the situation changed, but because your internal response did. This shift is quiet, almost invisible to others. From the outside, you may appear the same. You still participate, still speak, still act, but internally, there is more space between what happens and how you respond. And in that space, your energy is no longer constantly being pulled in different directions. There is also a reduction in the need to prove something, to convince others, to defend a position, to be seen in a certain way. These impulses begin to lose intensity, not because you suppress them, but because you see through them. You recognize that much of what people fight for is rooted in maintaining identities, protecting beliefs, reinforcing narratives, and once you see that clearly, it becomes harder to fully invest in the same patterns. The illusion becomes more transparent. This transparency does not isolate you. It frees you. You can still engage in meaningful conversations, still care about what matters, still take action when needed, but you are no longer driven by the same underlying tension. You are not trying to fix the entire structure of reality through every interaction. There is also a different relationship with uncertainty. Before, not knowing felt uncomfortable, even threatening. It created a need to search, to define, to resolve. Now, uncertainty becomes more tolerable, even neutral, because you no longer depend on constant mental closure to feel stable. This changes how you move through daily life. Decisions become simpler, not because you suddenly have all the answers, but because you are not overloading each choice with unnecessary weight. You respond to what is in front of you, instead of trying to calculate every possible outcome. And this creates a kind of efficiency that is not forced. Your energy is used where it matters, instead of being scattered across endless mental simulations. There is less internal noise, which means there is more clarity available when something actually requires your attention. This is what makes the state feel stable. Not rigid, not controlled, but grounded in something that does not fluctuate with every external change. But it's important to notice that this immunity is not something you achieve once and secure forever. The mind can still pull you back. Old patterns can resurface, especially in moments of stress or uncertainty. The difference is that now you can recognize it sooner. You can feel when you are starting to get pulled into the same loops, and that recognition itself weakens the pattern, because once you see the mechanism, it becomes harder for it to operate unconsciously. You may still get caught for a moment, but you don't stay there as long. The recovery is faster, more natural. Over time, this creates a new baseline, a way of being that is less reactive, less entangled, less dependent on controlling what cannot be controlled. And from this baseline, something else begins to emerge, a more direct way of acting in the world. Because when your energy is no longer tied up in constant mental friction, it becomes available for something more precise, something that does not come from overthinking or analyzing, but from a deeper alignment that starts to guide your actions in a way that feels both effortless and accurate. Many believe that this state of rest leads to paralysis, but the exact opposite happens. The moment you stop mentally calculating every risk with anxiety, you remove the blockages from your perception. Your biological intelligence aligns with the wisdom of the quantum field, and precise intuitions emerge from the void. Solutions for your physical life begin to arise from a state of pure effortlessness. This can feel surprising at first, because you were trained to associate action with pressure, to believe that in order to do something well, you need to think hard, analyze deeply, and anticipate every possible outcome. But if you look closely at your own experience, the moments where you acted with the most clarity were not the ones filled with noise. They were the ones where something felt obvious, a simple knowing without struggle, a decision that didn't require endless comparison. An action that felt direct, almost immediate, without the weight of overthinking behind it. Those moments are not random. They are glimpses of what happens when the mind is not interfering. Because when the internal friction is removed, perception becomes sharper. You start to notice details that were previously lost in mental noise. Small cues, subtle changes, intuitive signals that don't come as loud thoughts, but as quiet impressions. And these impressions often carry more accuracy than hours of anxious reasoning. Not because they are magical, but because they are not distorted by the need to control. The illusion loses its influence here in a very specific way. It no longer convinces you that every decision must be forced into certainty before you act. Instead, you begin to trust a different rhythm, one where understanding and action arise together, without the gap created by doubt and overanalysis. This does not mean you stop thinking altogether. Thinking still has its place, but it is no longer the dominant force behind every movement. It becomes a tool used when necessary, not a constant background process running without pause. And this changes the quality of your actions. Instead of being reactive, they become responsive. Instead of being rushed, they become timely. You don't move because you are pressured to resolve something, but because it is clear that movement is needed. There is a difference there that is easy to feel but hard to describe. When action comes from pressure, it carries tension. Even if the outcome is positive, there is a sense of effort, of pushing against something. But when action comes from clarity, it feels lighter, more precise, as if you are working with the situation, not against it. And often these actions are simpler than what the mind would have planned. A conversation you were avoiding becomes straightforward. A decision you were delaying becomes obvious. A problem that seemed complex reveals a direct path that was hidden under layers of overthinking. This is what happens when perception is no longer clouded. But there is also a phase where the mind tries to regain control. It sees this clarity and wants to own it. It starts asking, how do I make this happen again? Or how do I stay in this state? And in that attempt, it subtly reintroduces effort. Trying to reproduce effortlessness becomes another form of effort. And just like that, the friction begins to return. This is why it's important to see that this way of acting is not something you can manufacture. It is something that appears naturally when interference is reduced. The less you try to control every step, the more space there is for this kind of intelligence to operate. You begin to trust timing in a different way, not as a passive waiting, but as an active awareness. You see when something requires action and when it doesn't. You don't rush to fill every gap with movement, and because of that, when you do act, it carries more weight, more precision. There is also less regret. Because actions taken from clarity are not driven by fear or urgency, they don't leave the same residue. Even if the outcome is not perfect, there is no sense of, I should have done something different. There is a quiet acceptance, because the action came from the best possible perception available in that moment. This creates a different relationship with results. You still care, you still aim for improvement, but you are not emotionally tied to every outcome in the same way. The need to control the result weakens because you are more focused on the quality of your perception and the integrity of your action. And from that place, life starts to move with less resistance. Things still happen, challenges still appear, but you are no longer approaching them with the same internal struggle. There is a sense that you can meet what comes without needing to preemptively solve everything in your mind. And as this becomes more stable, something even deeper begins to settle within you. A recognition that you are not just someone acting within the world, trying to manage it, control it, or figure it out. There is also a part of you that remains untouched by all of it. A presence that observes, that allows, that exists independently of every situation and every outcome. And it is from this deeper center that a more profound mastery of experience starts to take shape. Mastering the state of non-reaction within the mind is the greatest of all human achievements. You may still be dealing with the worst crises of the modern world, paying bills and interacting within society, but at your center, you remain the empty sky where storms pass without leaving a trace. No simulation disguised as urgency will ever have the power to kidnap your light again. This mastery does not remove you from life. It refines how you experience it. From the outside, nothing dramatic needs to change. You still wake up, handle responsibilities, face challenges, and move through the same environments. But internally, there is a clear separation between what happens and what you are. Before everything felt merged, a problem appeared and you became the problem. A thought arose and you became the thought. An emotion surfaced and it defined your entire state. There was no space between the event and your identity. Now there is space. And in that space something becomes obvious. Life is constantly moving, constantly shifting, constantly presenting new scenes. But none of these scenes are stable enough to define you unless you hold on to them. This is where the metaphor of the theater becomes real in your experience. People play roles, situations unfold like scripts, emotions rise and fall like changing music, and for most of your life, you were not just watching the play, you were lost inside it, reacting to every line as if it were absolute reality. The illusion was not in the existence of the play, but in forgetting that it is a play. Mastery begins when you remember, not intellectually but directly. You see a tense situation, and part of you remains untouched. You hear strong opinions, and something in you does not feel the need to immediately agree or resist. You feel an emotion, but it does not take over your entire system. There is participation but not entanglement. This does not make you passive. In fact, it allows for more precise engagement, because when you are not overwhelmed by reaction, you can respond with clarity. You can speak when needed, remain silent when appropriate, act when necessary, all without the distortion created by internal pressure. And this creates a kind of stability that is not dependent on external conditions. Before, your state was constantly shifting based on what happened around you. A good moment lifted you. A bad moment pulled you down. You were moving with the waves, without any anchor. Now, the anchor is internal. It is not something you hold on to. It is something you recognize as already present. A quiet center that does not fluctuate with every change. And from this center, the waves are still visible, still real, but they no longer define your entire experience. This is what gives the sense of freedom. Not freedom from life, but freedom within it. You are no longer trying to control every scene, rewrite every script, or predict every outcome. You allow the play to unfold while remaining grounded in something deeper than any single moment. There is also a release of unnecessary struggle. Much of what once felt urgent begins to lose its intensity. Not because it is ignored, but because it is seen in proportion. You recognize when something truly requires attention, and when it is simply mental noise amplified by habit. And that recognition saves energy. Energy that was once spent on constant reaction is now available. It becomes presence, awareness, clarity. You feel less drained, not because life is easier, but because you are no longer fighting it at every step. Even in difficult situations, there is a different quality. You can face uncertainty without collapsing into anxiety. You can experience discomfort without immediately trying to escape it. You can move through complexity without needing instant resolution. Because you are no longer relying on the illusion of control to feel stable. There is trust, but not blind trust. It is not based on belief or hope. It comes from direct observation that life continues to move, to adjust, to reorganize itself without your constant interference. And this trust allows you to relax in a way that is not careless, but deeply grounded. At times, the mind may still try to pull you back into old patterns. A sudden challenge, an unexpected event, a strong emotional trigger. These can momentarily blur the clarity, but even then, something has changed. You notice it faster. You see the pull as it happens, and that seeing itself creates distance. The reaction may begin, but it does not fully take over. It loses strength more quickly, dissolving before it builds into something overwhelming. This is how mastery stabilizes, not by eliminating every reaction, but by reducing the time you remain identified with it. The recovery becomes natural, almost immediate. You return to that inner space without effort because you know it is always there, and as this becomes more consistent, a deeper understanding settles in. That what you truly are is not the actor, not the role, not the story being played out, but the space in which all of it appears. A space that is not affected by the content it holds. From this realization, the entire structure of the illusion loses its foundation. revealing something that was never hidden, only overlooked. The one who finds. The silence is no longer fooled by the illusion of truth. Abandon the exhausting war of trying to fix the broken world projected outside of you, and have the courage to dive into the empty space that lives within you. Ultimate freedom was never in the reward of finding the right answer, but in the greatness and infinite peace of no longer needing any more questions. What you were searching for was never hidden in complexity. It was covered by noise. And now you've seen that when the noise fades, something stable remains, something that doesn't need to prove, control, or defend. From here, life continues, but the weight is gone. If you made it this far, write in the comments, "I choose silence over the illusion." This shows you didn't just hear this, you felt it. If this resonated, watch one of the videos on your screen now. And if you want to go deeper and support the channel, consider becoming a member. Exclusive content is coming soon,